Welcome back. We continue now with our study of Willa Cather's A Wagner Matinee. I'm with you on page 656, and we will continue now with comments that will set up the experience of the woman, Josephine, being there to watch the actual performance itself. Let's follow along.
I asked her whether she had ever heard any of the Wagnerian operas, and found that she had not, though she was perfectly familiar with their respective situations and had once possessed the piano score of the Flying Dutchman. I began to think it would have been best to get her back to Red Willow County without waking her, and regretted having suggested the concert. From the time we entered the concert hall, however, she was a trifle less passive and inert, and seemed to begin to perceive her surroundings.
Now, I want to pause for a moment and bring you back to speed here at level 1. There is this, the whole story is built around this question of, is there a real difference between a city person and a country person? Are you fundamentally a different kind of student living out here in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming, than you would be if you lived, for example, in downtown Boston, and you went to school there? There are assumptions that, immediately, well, yeah, of course I'd be a different kind of student, but then when you get into the weeds of the question, like how? I mean, how would you be different? Would you look the same? Would you dress the same? These kinds of questions become central to this story. Now we will spend the rest of our time in the actual concert hall, and our observer, this man, will be looking, noticing his aunt as she goes through the process. Will she fit in? Will she understand at all what's going on? She spent 30 years out in the frontier. Can she even relate to a concert in Boston with all of these well-dressed people? All right, let's go. We're keeping now reading, top of the page.
I had felt some trepidation lest one might become aware of the absurdities of her attire.
Top of
or
657.
might experience some painful embarrassment at stepping suddenly into the world to which she had been dead for a quarter of a century. But again, I found how superficially I had judged her. She sat looking about her with eyes as impersonal, almost as stony, as those with which the granite Ramses in a museum watches the froth and fret that ebbs and flows about his pedestal, separated from it by the lonely stretch of centuries. I have seen this same aloofness in old miners who drift into the Brown Hotel at Denver, their pockets full of bullion, their linen soiled, their haggard faces unshorn, and who stand in the thronged corridors as solitary as though they were still in a frozen camp on the Yukon, or in the yellow blaze of the Arizona desert, conscious that certain experiences have isolated them from their fellows by a gulf no haberdasher could conceal. The audience was made up chiefly of women. One lost the contour of faces and figures, indeed any effective line whatever, and there was only the color contrast of bodices past counting, the shimmer and shading of fabrics soft and firm, silky and sheer, resisting and yielding, red, mauve, pink, blue, lilac, purple, ecru, rose, yellow, cream, and white, all the colors that an impressionist finds in a sunlit landscape, with here and there the dead black shadow of a frock coat. My Aunt Georgiana regarded them as though they had been so many daubs of tube paint on a palette. When the musicians came out and took their places, she gave a little stir of anticipation, and looked with quickening interest down over the rail at that invariable grouping, perhaps the first wholly familiar thing that had greeted her eye since she had left old Maggie and her weakling calf. I could feel how all those details sank into her soul, for I had not forgotten how they had sunk into mine when I came fresh from plowing forever and forever between green aisles of corn, where, as in a treadmill, one might walk from daybreak to dusk without perceiving a shadow of change in one's environment. I reminded myself of the impression made on me by the clean profiles of the musicians, the gloss of their linen, the dull black of their coats, the beloved shapes of the instruments, the patches of yellow light thrown by the green-shaded stand lamps on the smooth, varnished bellies of the cellos and the bass viols in the rear, the restless, wind-tossed forest of fiddlenecks and bows. I recalled how, in the first orchestra I had ever heard, those long bow strokes seemed to draw the soul out of me, as a conjurer's stick reels out paper ribbon from a hat. The first number was the Tannhauser Overture. When the violins drew out the first
Top of page
string of Pilgrim's
659.
chorus, my Aunt Georgiana clutched my coat sleeve. Then it was that I first realized that for her, this singing of basses and stinging frenzy of lighter strings broke a silence of 30 years, the inconceivable silence of the plains. With the battle between the two motifs, with the bitter frenzy of the Venusberg theme and its ripping of strings, came to me an overwhelming sense of the waste and wear we are so powerless to combat. I saw again the tall, naked house on the prairie, black and grim as a wooden fortress, the black pond where I had learned to swim, the rain-gullied clay about the naked house, the 4 dwarf ash seedlings on which the dishcloths were always hung to dry before the kitchen door. The world there is the flat world of the ancients. To the east, a cornfield that stretched to daybreak. To the west, a corral that stretched to sunset. Between, the sordid conquests of peace, more merciless than those of war.
It's a brilliant kind of storytelling technique that Cather will use to describe he and his aunt sitting in this really nice decorum of the Boston Symphony. And then when he looks at her and watches her watching the performance, his mind goes back to the plains of Nebraska, where as a boy he lived with this woman. As far as the eye can see, nothing but grassy plains. It's Nebraska, right? Back at the turn of the century. And he's recognizing that for her, this has to be a surreal moment where she grew up as a little girl seeing this. Then she left for 30 years and lived out in a rough part of America in the plains. And now she's come back to see it again. And how it has to be for her a really kind of surreal experience. Let's watch how it ends.
The overture closed. My aunt released my coat sleeve, but she said nothing. She sat staring at the orchestra through a dullness of 30 years, through the films made, little by each of the 365 days in every one of them. What, I wondered, did she get from it? She had been a good pianist in her day, I knew, and her musical education had been broader than that of most music teachers of a quarter of a century ago. She had often told me of Mozart's operas and Meyerbeer's, and I could remember hearing her sing, years ago, certain melodies of Verdi. When I had fallen ill with a fever, she used to sit by my cot in the evening, while the cool night wind blew in through the faded mosquito netting tacked over the window, and I lay watching a bright star that burned red above the cornfield, and sing, "Home to our mountains, oh let us return," in a way fit to break the heart of a Vermont boy near dead of homesickness already. I watched her closely through the prelude to Tristan and Isolde, trying vainly to conjecture what that warfare of motifs, that seething turmoil of strings and winds might mean to her. Had this music any message for her? Did or did not a new planet swim into her ken? Wagner had been a sealed book to Americans before the 60s. Had she anything left with which to comprehend this glory that had flashed around the world since she had gone from it? I was in a fever of curiosity, but Aunt Georgiana sat silently upon her peak in Darien. She preserved this utter immobility throughout the numbers from the Flying Dutchman, though her fingers worked mechanically upon her black dress, as though of themselves they were recalling the piano score they had once played. Poor old hands. They were stretched and
Top of
pulled
660.
and twisted into mere tentacles to hold and lift and knead with, the palms unduly swollen, the fingers bent and knotted, on one of them a thin worn band that had once been a wedding ring. As I pressed and gently quieted one of those groping hands, I remembered with quivering eyelids their services for me in other days. Soon after the tenor began the prize song, I heard a quick-drawn breath and turned to my aunt. Her eyes were closed, but the tears were glistening on her cheeks, and I think in a moment more they were in my eyes as well. It never really dies then, the soul. It withers to the outward eye only, like that strange moss which can lie on a dusty shelf half a century, and yet, if placed in water, grows green again. My aunt wept gently throughout the development and elaboration of the melody. During the intermission before the second half of the concert, I questioned my aunt and found that the prize song was not new to her. Some years before, there had drifted to the farm in Red Willow County a young German, a tramp cowpuncher who had sung in the chorus at Bayreuth when he was a boy, along with the other peasant boys and girls. Of a Sunday morning, he used to sit on his blue gingham-sheeted bed in the Hans bedroom, which opened off the kitchen, cleaning the leather of his boots and saddle and singing the prize song, while my aunt went about her work in the kitchen. She had hovered about him until she had prevailed upon him to join the country church, though his sole fitness for this step, so far as I could gather, lay in his boyish face and his possession of this divine melody. Shortly afterward, he had gone to town on the 4th of July, lost his money at a faro table, ridden a saddled Texas steer on a bet, and disappeared with a fractured collarbone. Well, we have come to better things than the old Trovatore at any rate, Aunt Georgie? I queried with well-meant jocularity. Her lip quivered, and she hastily put her handkerchief up to her mouth. From behind it she murmured, "And you've been hearing this ever since you left me, Clark?" Her question was the gentlest and saddest of reproaches. "But do you get it, Aunt Georgiana? The astonishing structure of it all?" I persisted. "Who could?" she said absently. "Why should one?" The second half of the program consisted of 4 numbers from The Ring. This was followed by the forest music from Siegfried, and the program closed with Siegfried's funeral march. My aunt wept quietly, but almost continuously. I was perplexed as to what
Top of
measure of musical
661.
comprehension was left to her who had heard nothing for so many years but the singing of gospel hymns and Methodist services at the square frame schoolhouse on Section 13. I was unable to gauge how much of it had been dissolved in soapsuds, or worked into bread, or milked into the bottom of a pail. The deluge of sound poured on and on. I never knew what she found in the shining current of it. I never knew how far it bore her, or past what happy islands, or under what skies. From the trembling of her face, I could well believe that the Siegfried March at least carried her out where the myriad graves are, out into the gray burying grounds of the sea, or into some world of death vaster yet, where from the beginning of the world, hope has lain down with hope, and dream with dream, and renouncing slept. The concert was over. The people filed out of the hall, chattering and laughing, glad to relax and find the living level again, but my kinswoman made no effort to rise. I spoke gently to her. She burst into tears and sobbed pleadingly, "I don't want to go, Clark. I don't want to go." I understood. For her, just outside the door of the concert hall, lay the black pond with the cattle-tracked bluffs, the tall, unpainted house, naked as a tower, with weather-curled boards, the crook-backed ash seedlings where the dishcloths hung to dry, the gaunt, molting turkeys, picking up refuse about the kitchen door.
Now, this story, let's exegete together. This story created quite a bit of hurt feelings by readers out in the American Midwest and the Plain States when the story was read and published and read because of the ending. So you have Georgiana, who has lived for 30 years on the plain, a tough, tough gal. She is a plains woman. She has known what it's like to be ironing at midnight, to make meals for large numbers of people, to have to hang your clothes up on a clothesline out on a tree, all of those kinds of things, right? She has lived a hard life. And now she comes to Boston, and she goes to this really nice concert hall, and she listens to this amazingly beautiful music by the German composer Wagner. And at the end of it, she says, I don't want to go. I don't want to go. Which seems to suggest that this life of refinement, of luxury, is one that she had forgotten about living out in the plains, but now that she's back with it, she doesn't want to return. Which seems to suggest now at 2A, let's talk really quickly about some possible messages and themes. One of them is that it's a lot nicer to live in a place where you can have the experience of a symphony, where you can have the experience of culture, high culture it might be called, instead of living in a place where none of that really exists. But there's other messages here as well. Let's outline them, shall we? One possible message is that there is a fundamental difference, but it's not a better or worse difference. It's just a difference between growing up in the country and growing up in the city. There's different kinds of art forms. And the art forms, for example, that we would consider to be kind of high art forms, classical music and the like, is maybe not something that is necessarily better, but just different from the art forms of living in the country, living in a more rural area. A third and final message here is the possibility of a discussion point, that we can often forget what we've known as a child. And then when we come back to it as an adult, all kinds of powerful feelings and emotions can be associated with that. Let's jump to 2B really quickly and talk about characterization. We set us up in our 2B observations this way: direct and indirect characterization. Notice that Cather does a brilliant job of talking about this character, this woman, this narrator's aunt, who is a woman who started out a certain kind of person, then falls in love and runs off to the frontier, lives for 30 years, and it fundamentally has changed her as a person. And yet, the question will be, has it really? Notice that there is this ability by Cather to create a character that is going to be for us understandable on multiple levels. We can appreciate that she is this tough frontierswoman, but we also are quite attracted to the fact that she wants to stay and listen to more of the beautiful music that she cannot hear living where she lives. Let's talk level 3 for a few moments and talk about relationships to this text, starting in 3A, how you relate to other texts. What is for you your favorite TV show or movie that is set in the plains or the mountain states region? In other words, it's a movie or a TV show that shows life as being very hard out here in the American West, on the plains. Do you have a favorite film that kind of is set during this time, or a favorite TV show? Do you play a video game, for example, that maybe is set during this time? Do you have a favorite movie or TV show that talks about the differences between living in the city and living in a rural or country kind of setting? Is there a film that you call to mind for you of a person who, for example, shows up in the city and has to negotiate what that's like because he or she is from a rural area, the plains, maybe the mountain states, right? Or conversely, do you have a favorite film where somebody from the city shows up out here at a place like this and has to try to survive and go through that experience, and that is not always so easy, right? Okay, is that for you a film that you're familiar with? Let's jot down the great films of travel, the great texts of travel. Of course, the greatest is Homer's Odyssey. That story that tells about a famous hero that has to travel a long journey and has all of these adventures. Notice how Cather is kind of playing with that notion of the Odyssey, of the journey, and the ways in which a character has to come to terms with the ways in which maybe she's changed in some ways, okay, over time. Let's finally get to 3B. Your own view of this. I'll ask a few questions. You can jot down answers. Do you think there is a fundamental difference between being raised in the city and being raised in the country? Is there really much of a difference between growing up in a town of 5,000 people, like you do, and living or growing up in a town of 5 million people? Is there a difference? How would you be a different person, for example, if you had grown up in New York City or Chicago or even Denver? Now, some of you did grow up in larger cities and then you moved to this small town. So let's ask that question. What's that been like for you? Coming to a place that you have not grown up that's totally different in terms of, for example, size and population. Is it true that living in a town like Worland, you do have things that you miss? There are, for example, things that are different. A colleague of mine arriving and saying, hey, let's go to the show, and, because there's so many out there, we got an option, right, obviously, of about 20 different movies that we can watch tonight. Which movie do you want to watch? And I said, well, no, actually, we only have 2 movies available to us in our little theater here. You only get to pick from 2. And he was incredulous. 2? That's it? Just 2? And this conversation was being had in front of an old-timer who said, well, yeah, but for many years in Worland, there was only 1 film that was shown, and you were lucky if the projection camera worked that night. And, of course, it just, again, kind of suggests that there's these different things. Do you feel like you miss a lot living in a small town? And what do you think you gain by living in a small town? Maybe that's another interesting question. A final 3B question for you. Looking forward. If you had to choose the option for you to live your life in either the big city or the small town, which would you choose and why? Jot it down real quickly. Would you prefer to live in a town of millions, or would you prefer to live in a town of just a few hundred or a few thousand? Or is there a middle ground for you, right, that maybe allows you to have some sense of it as well? A final